Welcome to the course on Dalit literature. Today we will be focusing on Dalit poetry. Today will be an introductory lecture on Dalit poetry called Dalit Poetry and Overview. I am Archit Nanda, an assistant professor at Keshav Mahavidyalaya, University of Delhi. Today we will be looking at how Dalit poetry was influenced by the movement started by Ambedkar and how even contemporary Dalit poets look back to Ambedkar as an inspiration, as a guide for their movement. And this is what we will trace in today's lecture. So the Ambedkar is, as I say, the spirit behind Dalit literature. It was Ambedkar's modernism, his rationalism, his spirit of revolt, which provided the philosophical context of the Marathi Dalit literature. This is a statement made by Gail Omwit in an article on Ambedkar and Dalit literature. And in some ways, it is strange to say that a man who did not write a single piece of poem in his whole life, a man who never wrote a novel or short story, can be a person who can start a new literary movement. But in the case of Ambedkar, it is true. Because if I have to say it in simple terms, Ambedkar created the preconditions for Dalit literature to find its voice. He created a kind of a certain systematic system which allowed Dalit literature to later grow and find its voice in the world. So it was through his struggles against untouchability and socio-economic inequality, Ambedkar liberated the Dalits in India from mental slavery and abject wretchedness, thus giving them a new self-respect. This is what Arjun Dangle says in the introduction to his book Poisoned Bread. It is this struggle against untouchability, socio-economic inequality, which allowed the Dalit writers to later create important works of fiction. And Ambedkar, if one has to say it in simple terms, Ambedkar gave them the mind which later was explored in and expressed through Dalit poetry, Dalit literature. How did he give them the mind? He gave them the mind by fighting a social movement against caste. He gave them the mind by fighting a legal battles against caste. He gave them the mind by in some ways instituting a completely new social framework, a political consciousness among the Dalits that later got absorbed into their literature. Gail Omwit in one place states, if Dalits throughout India revere Ambedkar, it is because he had played the role in their lives, giving them minds to understand and move ahead with. Now we will understand how Ambedkar in some ways gave them this mind. What was it fundamental to Ambedkar's thought, Ambedkar's life, that allowed him to, in some ways awaken an entire population? And as we say, to build a new consciousness. When I use the word mind, it means to build a new consciousness, a new thought process, a new political reality, a new social movement, and which in turn gives birth to a new literary movement. So how did Ambedkar do this? One has to understand the lives of the Dalits before Ambedkar. Why people say that Ambedkar was behind Dalit literature is because in some ways Dalit literature prior to Ambedkar did not exist. We have some remnants of what could be called as Dalit literature. We will talk about that. But in proper Dalit literature or consciousness did not exist because people who had never known life as normal human beings, who had no cultural or literary legacy in a country oppressed by caste, where they were dominated by upper caste people, where they were marginalized to the brinks of the society, they had no way to in some ways engage in activities which are literary or poetry or artistic. All of these things were absent from their life because their life was a struggle against reality. And it is to take that life beyond the struggles from reality to a literary expression what Ambedkar contributed. Ambedkar contributed in allowing them to express about their lives apart from their everyday struggles. But not only that, it isn't that there weren't Dalit writers before the coming of the Ambedkar. If we look at the medieval Indian times, there were many saints who belonged to the Dalit community and who composed important poetry during their times, such as Tukaram, such as Ravidas. But one thing that characterizes these saints is that they did not had the spirit which is governed by modern Dalit literature. This is a spirit of political revolution. This is a spirit of self-affirmation. This is a spirit that seeks to transform social reality, that seeks to challenge social institutions in a way that Dalits get their fair share of space in Indian democracy, in Indian nationhood, in India as a country as a whole. So through these ways, Ambedkar created the precondition for Dalit literature, and he did it by offering, I would say, three major things: a legal, social, cultural, and political critique of Indian society while leading multiple mass movements across India. And now we will look at what were the legal, social, cultural, and political critiques that he offered, where did he offer them, and how he led multiple mass movements across the country. So the first is religious, social, and political critique. Ambedkar built the precondition for Dalit literature through his books, his social movements, and his legal framework. Now, his books are some of the most harrowing and accounts of the lives of Dalits, but also some of the most critical accounts of how the Indian society has suppressed Dalits across thousands of years. And he traces that in not one book, multiple volumes written across time. So, from his early days when he was a student in 1919, he wrote a very famous paper which was presented in Columbia University, which looked at the issue of caste. And that paper was the beginning of a lifelong theoretical engagement with Dalit politics, with Dalit criticism, with Dalit histories. From that, he went on to write books that not only looked at how Dalit politics was shaped in contemporary times. For example, in books where he looks at the relationship of what Congress has done to the Dalits, how Gandhi has behaved with the Dalits, but also books that try to understand how a caste society was created in India. So he writes a historical account of who were the Shudras, how did they come into being. These long theoretical engagement that spanned from 1919 till the time of his death in 1955, in 1956, accounts the refashioning or the reconditioning of how Dalit ideas were thought about in India, how Dalit people were seen in India, and building towards a new caste consciousness. Now, the most important testament to this history is his 1936 lecture, which was titled Annihilation of Caste. And that lecture offers a theoretical critique of the caste system, and it also goes back to say that how caste system is what underlies and is intrinsic to the entire Hindu religion. So when he does criticize the caste system, he does not leave behind the Hindu religion. He says even though caste can be okay, one has to understand some social context in order to grasp what Ambedkar is saying. During those times, there were social reformers who wanted to challenge the caste system. There was this whole movement called Jat Paat Todak Mandal. They had called Ambedkar to give this speech titled Annihilation of Caste. Now, what they wanted to do was they saw religion and caste as two distinct categories. They said as if caste has been imposed on Hindu religion and it can easily be separated. So they wanted to retain the entire Hindu identity, whereas get rid of the caste system as a whole. What Ambedkar argued in his polemical speech, Annihilation of Caste, was that there is no way that one can imagine Hinduism without the existence of caste. In some ways, the most important texts of Hinduism, such as the Dharma Shastras, deal intrinsically with caste and caste hierarchies. So to talk about Hindu religion as if it can be separated from caste is to live in a world of fantasy. And therefore, he underlined a new phenomena or new method of annihilating the caste system, but which also meant challenging the foundations of the Hindu religion to a certain extent. So this was one of the theoretical paradigms he offered. It was not the only one. but it was one of the most important. It over the period of 40 years that these paradigms, he offered both a historical, a sociological, anthropological, political analysis of the origins of the problems of the Dalits of this country were facing. And in some ways, all of this can be elaborated by one single quotation from Annihilation of Caste. You know, at one moment in Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar says, caste system is not merely a division of labor, it is also a division of laborers. Civilized society undoubtedly needs division of labor, but in no civilized society is division of labor accompanied by this unnatural division of laborers into watertight compartments. What Ambedkar here essentially means is that we often see society as divided, as people in a society divided among doing different kinds of tasks. So there are people who are engaged in teaching, there are people who are students, there are people who are engaged in politics, there are people who are actors, there are filmmakers, and this in some ways is intrinsic to all societies, from the most menial of the job to the most important job, from the person who's working at small place to the prime minister. Everyone is engaged in some level of contribution towards the society. This is a principle that exists in all society. But what the caste system did was that it did not divide society in terms of labor. It also divided society in terms of laborers, which meant that the people from a particular caste could only engage with one kind of work. So the Brahmins could only do one kind of work, the Dalits could only do one kind of work. And in some ways, the most pathetic, the most hard-bearing, the most oppressive work was handed down to the lowest of the castes. They had to do the manual scavenging, they had to do landless labor work, and in no way did they have the possibility in ancient Indian society to penetrate out of this caste system, to go out of their chosen profession and to go to some other profession. So it was not that you could get educated and you could become something else. You were born with a caste identity, you performed that caste identity throughout your entire life, and you died with that caste identity. It is this watertight compartments where everything is kept hierarchically, where people from the lower end cannot go up, from the up cannot go low, and people are not judged on the merit, on the professionalism that they show in their jobs, but merely on their birth, the caste in which they are born. This division of labor is what Ambedkar challenged through his existence, through his life, but also of what he offered to the Dalit population as a whole. So Ambedkar challenged this division of laborers on the basis of caste, and his theoretical output, which spanned over a period of 40 years, ensured that Dalit movement could not be seen in the same light. These works, whether they were read by the Dalit population or if they spread by the word of mouth, they changed something fundamental in Dalit movement, and this was his theoretical contribution to Dalit literature, or the beginning of Dalit literature, or what we call as the precondition that he set up for the beginning of Dalit literature. The second precondition that Ambedkar set up was through his social movements like Mahar Satyagraha. He infused a new political consciousness among his people by engaging in a social movement across with Dalits. So there are two primary social movements that infused this political consciousness. One was the Mahar Satyagraha, where he challenged the dictum in that particular locality where Dalits were not allowed to take water from the well, and he publicly went there to withdraw water from the well in a public demonstration with thousands of Dalits around him, marking a public refusal of their caste identity and a kind of a transcendence of their caste identity at that moment. The second was the mass conversion to Buddhism. At the end of his life, Ambedkar realized, and it was a systematic study throughout his entire career, that he realized that Hinduism could not offer a space for a figure like him, for a Dalit thinker like him, and it could not offer a proper space for even the Dalit population. Therefore, in 1956, he decided to convert into Buddhism, and this was a conversion that was not a conversion of a single man, but many people around, they say lakhs of people joined Ambedkar, primarily from the Mahar community, to convert with him. Now, this was how Ambedkar not only influenced intellectually or theoretically the Dalit movement, but also through social movements, through political movements like Mahar Satyagraha. Through conversion, he created the space for Dalit electorate or Dalit literature to, spark off or to be born. He also fought for separate electorates for the depressed classes, and when that failed, he ensured that caste was institutionalized in Indian constitution in the form of reservations. He ensured that reservation was given to his people. So education, theoretical engagement, and political struggle led to the birth of what we call, or led to the creating the conditions that gave birth to Dalit literature. Apart from that, he also ran periodicals like Muknaya, Beheshkrit Bharat, Janata, and Prabuddha Bharat to create a public consciousness about caste. In these periodicals, he wrote multiple articles, edited them in order to reach out to people across his community, across the nation, and across the world, so that the consciousness about caste is created. And most fundamental contribution of Ambedkar in Maharashtra was that he personally set up multiple colleges in that state. One of the famous colleges being the Siddharth College, to promote education among the Dalit community. Dalits during those times were ostracized and marginalized in conventional institutions, whereas these institutions, which were built by Ambedkar, offered them a space to study and to grow. And many of the writers who became prominent in Marathi literature later came from these universities and these colleges. So what Ambedkar has contributed so much to caste, but there are so many other leaders who are also claimed to be anti-caste leaders who are fighting for the Dalits. What is it that distinguishes Ambedkar from a figure like Gandhi? The first primary thing that distinguishes Ambedkar from Gandhi is that Ambedkar had a personal experience of caste. For Gandhi, caste was an issue that affected the society and the nation, but Gandhi looked at it from outside, from the perspective of an upper caste, whereas Ambedkar had experienced in his own life the discrimination that come with caste. So it is these personal experiences that shaped his politics, that shaped the movement that he gave birth to, and in some ways makes him different from all major leaders who also spoke against the caste system. The second thing that distinguishes Ambedkar from Gandhi is Ambedkar's education. The Dalit movement needed a leader not only who was politically active, not only who had experienced the atrocities of caste, but a leader who could be a source of inspiration, who, even though having been born to a caste society, having experienced oppression, could break through those barriers and go and get the best degrees in the world. And Ambedkar was one representative of such a figure, because he went to get 2 degrees from abroad. He studied law in London, and then he got a PhD in Columbia University, America. It is this figure of Ambedkar as an educated man, as a person who has studied with the most studied in the most prestigious institutions, who could talk as easily about caste history as he could talk about Indian economy. This was a figure that became a source of inspiration from all Dalits, and this level of education was absent from all national leaders of that time and all the other leaders who were against caste. The third thing was, Ambedkar, unlike many nationalist leaders of his time, was not interested in political change. Or even if he was interested in political change, he believed the primacy of the social reform. He stated that, the independence from Britishers is not what matters to a great extent for the Dalit community, because even prior to Britishers coming into the country, they were suppressed. So what needed to alter in the country was the social structure, the social fabric of the country, and that could change by the reorganization of the of caste system, the reorganization of how people treated people from particular castes. So this in some ways marked him different from other political leaders whose immediate aim was to get India independent from the British, whereas Ambedkar's immediate aim was to ensure that there is a social reform in our society. The fourth thing that differentiates Ambedkar from other anti-caste leaders is his wide knowledge. So the last point that differentiates Ambedkar from other anti-caste leaders is his knowledge. This is related to his education. It is his education that contributed to his knowledge, but there is something else. Ambedkar was someone who showed an expertise in all subjects, whether he dealt with the history of how jatis were formed, or with the question of Pakistan, or when it comes to the Indian economy, or when it comes to writing about the Indian constitution. In all domains that he touched, he was an expert, he was a leader, he had the knowledge that was unmatched by any Indian leader of that time. And therefore, while writing about caste or while writing the Indian constitution, the Dalit community saw him as a representative of their entire aspiration. This is what they wanted to be: an intellectual, a person who was both knowledgeable, who was connected to the ground, who believed in social reform, and who also belonged to the Dalit community and had personally experienced the brutality and the atrocities that are faced by them. All of this combined together made him the ideal leader for the Dalit politics. So, when it comes to our focus here is not Ambedkar as a politician, but Ambedkar and his intersection with literature. But what do we talk about Ambedkar and literature? Because we know Ambedkar hasn't written any literary work. Unlike his predecessor, Jyotiba Phule, Ambedkar himself wrote no poetry, no short stories, and communicated to the masses only through his speeches or through his writings, theoretical writings. So how can we think about a relationship between Ambedkar and literature? One of the key common points that we find is that Ambedkar throughout his writings, especially in Marathi, quotes heavily from Bhakti poets such as Chokhamela, Kabir, Ravidas. It is this tradition of Dalit poets from medieval era that in some ways influences Ambedkar to such an extent that he even dedicated one of his famous books, The Untouchables, Who Were They and Why They Became, to three Bhakti poets, Nandanar, Ravidas and Chokhamela. And in the introduction and in the dedication he stated, three renowned poets who were born among the untouchables and who by their piety and virtue won the esteem of all. It is this legacy that Ambedkar saw in his movement, in his political movement, that literature, at least medieval literature produced by Bhakti poets, had a limited but important role to play in the modern politics, and therefore he quoted profusely from them. He engaged with the literature, he dedicated his books to them, and in one of his speech, Ambedkar mentions that he has three main gurus in his life: Buddha, Kabir and Phule. Buddha represented his religious conversion at the end of his life. Phule, his political commitment towards the cause of the Bahujan people of our country. But Kabir is an interesting entry to it. He considers Kabir, who was a poet and a singer, crucial in creating and shaping Dalit identity while challenging the dominance of upper caste Hindus. So a poet like Kabir finds an important presence in Ambedkar's oeuvre, so much so that he considers him as one of his gurus. There are only, if we have to look for direct engagement between Ambedkar's engagement with literature, one can find perhaps two editorials where Ambedkar explicitly deals with the idea of literature. One was his review of a contemporary Marathi play which talked about untouchability. Ambedkar criticized the play in a review of the play, stating that the untouchability cannot be removed by the character who had been created on screen, the protagonist of the play, because that protagonist was servile, was ready to bend down in front of upper caste, and in some ways the Dalit protagonist had to be self-asserting, self-conscious, and in a way proud of his achievements. Someone who could be like Ambedkar himself. That is how he imagined Dalit protagonists. Even though this was a small comment made upon a singular play, it had a long-lasting influence on Dalit literature. Many of the later discussions on Dalit literary sphere, whenever they have discussed the shape of a Dalit protagonist, they have always wanted to create protagonists who were able to assert themselves, speak for themselves, and are not servile and towards the entire system that oppresses them. So this was one explicit reference to literature in Ambedkar's work. The other was another editorial where Ambedkar wrote in Marathi called as an overhaul of old literature. Ambedkar said that the new Marathi literature, which included novels, which included literary works, were unlike the old folk songs. And in some ways, the folk songs were dying in the process as the new literature gained prominence. And he made a pact that he will record and write these folk songs, collect them, and prepare a volume about that. And the article ends with one of the folk songs that Ambedkar has collected. But the article is also significant because it underlies Ambedkar's interest with Bhakti poetry. Ambedkar was not interested in poetry that was written down and circulated among the intelligentsia. He was interested in poetry that could be sung. He was interested in the embodiment of the poetry in spoken word. And therefore, he was very keenly interested in the folk traditions of medieval Bhakti poets, and as well as the folk traditions that translated into our own contemporary times. So here was his commitment towards the folk song. Now, what is the prehistory of Dalit literature? Where do we see Dalit literature beginning from? Though it is said that the Dalit literature came after 1950s, there are some precedents. We have already spoken about them. Even before contemporary Dalit literature, there were elements of protest and dissent prevalent against the caste society in various forms. I will talk about two explicit forms. One we have discussed at length. Bhakti poets such as Kabir, Chokha Mela, and Ravidas often wrote against caste system in their points. Even though the problem with these writers, or at least Ambedkar's problem with these writers, was that even though they established the equality of men before God, they could not challenge the social structure of their society. So for Kabir, for God, everyone is equal. No one is a Julahar, no one is a Brahmin. But in the society, they continue to live lives as a Julahar or as a Kumhar, rather than challenging those social frameworks and transcending those social boundaries. So they offered a kind of a transcendental equality, but not a social equality. And Ambedkar was looking for social equality in his times. So here one can find traces of the literature. There were also, during Ambedkar's own time, Ambedkarite jalsas or street performances that began in Ambedkar's own time and took the message of education, revolt, and class struggle to the masses. These two elements can be thought of as a prehistory of Dalit literature, but largely what we see a Dalit literature flourishing and beginning only after Ambedkar. And one of the primary foundations of it was the first Dalit literary conference, which was planned for December 1956, but the untimely death of Ambedkar led to the delay in the conference. It was later organized in 1958. This first Dalit literary conference was the beginning of what we can call as modern Dalit literature. Of course, Anna Bahu Sahte, who was a prominent Marxist and Dalit scholar, who gave the inaugural speech at the conference, had been writing for many decades before. But still, this can be seen as one of the major movements when Dalit literature finds its footing. So, in the inaugural address to the speech to the conference, Anna Bahu Sahate says, "The earth is not balanced precariously on the Shashnag's hood, but rests secure in the Dalit and workers' hands." So, in what he's trying to underline is that the world runs not through mythical creatures, not through some fantastical medieval mythological beliefs, not even to the works of the richest of the people, but through the hands of the poorest and the workers and the Dalits and the workers of the community. And it is these hands that need to be sung in literature, that need to be written about in literature. His words, in a way, fired up in the imagination of the Dalit people as he motivated them to live and depict the lives of the people. He says, and I quote from the speech, "The artist that lives with the people is the artist the people stand by. The author who turns his back on people will find that literature has turned its back on him." So, very clear words in the inaugural conference: to live with people, to write about people, to embody their struggles in our literary words, to be part of those struggles, to fight together. That is what the new Dalit literature underlined, at least the first conference underlined as a framework. And the second was to institutionalize Dalit literature as an important component of universities as well as society. A resolution was passed in the conference declaring that, and I quote, "The literature written by Dalits and that written by others about the Dalits in Marathi be accepted as a separate entity known as Dalit literature, which should be given important space in universities and literary organizations." So the work of Dalit writers, as well as what other people have written about Dalit, should come under a new category of literature, a kind of literature that we are studying now. So this revolution passed at the first Dalit Literary Conference could be seen as the beginning of modern Dalit literature. And with this, we come to the end of the first lecture on Dalit poetry, which was an overview on Dalit poetry. And in this lecture, we looked at how Ambedkar, even though he never wrote poetry, was the spirit behind Dalit literature. And Ambedkar also created the preconditions for the beginning of Dalit literature by his theoretical engagement with Dalit lives, by his political movements, by the colleges he started, and through the magazines and periodicals in which he wrote profusely. All of these contributed together to create a situation in the world where Dalits could finally turn out and become writers and poets. And it was this budding of this, at least precondition, found its fruit right 2 years after the death of Ambedkar in 1958, when the first Dalit conference was held, which sowed the seeds of Dalit literature. And now I will see you in the next section, continuing on Dalit poetry and overview. Thank you, everyone.